All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to take a look at some updates around the ongoing war in Gaza. There's been a handful of kind of controversial stories that have come out in the last couple days. Felt like it was worth walking through those, explaining what we know so far. Starting, however, I want to look at a map overview to kind of give an idea of the different areas of the battlefield that we're going to talk about. So starting here, zoomed out, looking at all of Israel. The area of focus today is going to be in Gaza, the southwest portion of Israel. The ground operation that Israel kicked off in Gaza a few months ago, by and large, started up here in the north and pushed south. That's important for a couple of reasons. One, Israel largely evacuated the areas of the north. Civilians, Palestinian civilians, fled south, right? They weren't able to cross into Israel, so they were essentially trapped in Gaza between the sea and Israeli territory. They headed south slowly to places like Khan Yunis and then eventually to further north to Rafah. A lot of the aid and the encampments have been set up in the southern portions of the Gaza Strip. This can be important. Again, a lot of the civilians have been flowing north to south. Now, the information we got over the last couple of days is that Israel has started to move back in to portions of the northern Gaza Strip. And when they're in there, they're getting into significant fights with Hamas. So Israel put out the other day that they just withdrew forces from the Zaytun neighborhood, which is right here. Again, the general northern portion of the Gaza Strip. IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari said that Israeli troops had killed more than 150 Hamas gunmen and destroyed at least 80 terror sites used by the group in the Zaytun neighborhood, which we're going to get through this in a couple different ways, but this is sounding more and more like a classic counterinsurgency, right? Israel moved through all of Gaza for the most part. They're down here in the south and haven't fully operated in the Rafah area, but especially up north, they moved through this whole area, occupied the full area, cleared out quite a bit of this urban area, and now just a short while later, they're back in there fighting some of these Hamas elements again. Israel also said that their 98th Division pushed into the Jabalia area up here, also in the northern portion of the Gaza Strip. They say that during the course of that fighting, they got into some pretty significant contact with dozens of armed squads of Hamas militants and killed a large number of terrorists over the last couple days. So again, while most of the focus right now continues to be on Rafah and what Israel is going to do in the southern portion of the Gaza Strip, we're seeing continually that Israel is having to push back into areas that they have previously cleared. Sounds an awful lot like counterinsurgency. And I know the argument here would be, so what is Israel supposed to do? How are they supposed to handle it? I don't know. We didn't exactly knock it out of the park when it comes to figuring out counterinsurgency through Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria. It's a challenging fight, and Israel is right in the middle of that right now. Now, shifting down here to the Rafah area, where much of the focus has been and really should be right now. Again, we talked about how many of the civilians have moved from north to south. The estimates were wide-ranging just a few weeks ago, everywhere from 1 to like 2.5 million people supposedly could have been in this Rafah area, which is large, all things considered. It's not just one little section here. It's the whole southern portion of the Gaza Strip. 2.5 million is probably on the high side. What we've seen in recent days after Israel announced the evacuation of this area ahead of military operations is as many as 450,000 people have fled that area, and we have seen the beginning of Israel starting to push into portions of Rafah, especially here in the east. The map is a little canted, but kind of the southeast here. The IDF spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, was down in the Rafah area just a couple days ago, and he said that some of the commanders there, in speaking with the chief of the general staff, said, quote, there are hostages in the Rafah area. To be expected. Again, this is kind of the last area that the IDF has yet to move into. So the fact that there are hostages there and probably a significant number of Hamas militants is to be expected at this point. Now, one of the arguments that I've heard, this is speculation, put it a little bit in the opinion camp at this point, but one of the reasons that this operation has moved forward is that Israel believes that there are fewer civilians and more Hamas militants in Rafah than previously expected, which makes sense if you think about it. If you're Hamas, it makes sense to slow, while Israel is moving north to south, why not move north to south yourself, right? Hamas is not trying to get into a war of attrition with the IDF. They're trying to survive. The way to survive, if you're Hamas, is to not get into direct contact with the IDF. So it makes sense that a lot of Hamas militants would have moved into the Rafah area. Conversely, if you are a Palestinian civilian, and there's a wide range of opportunities available here, right? Not everybody, I don't want to make it seem like anybody can just get up and move whenever they want in the middle of a war zone, but Israel has been reopening areas like Khan Yunis recently. And there's been a lot of humanitarian aid brought into areas like Khan Yunis and further north, where Palestinian civilians have been able to return home, or at least return to areas where they would have previously called home, and leave Rafah. And how many of those people would have seen the Israeli actions over the last few weeks, really preparing for this Rafah operation, and thought, you know what, I shouldn't be here. There might still be targeted raids and operations further north, but I know something's coming in Rafah, and we have started to see that in recent days with a significant increase in airstrikes in the Rafah area. So it's entirely likely that, yes, there are more Hamas militants in Rafah than previously expected, and more civilians evacuated that area before the formal evacuation order came down. Now, we are seeing a significant uptick, not just in Israeli reports of contact, but also from Hamas. Just over the last 72 hours, Hamas has claimed responsibility for 50 separate attacks, at least 50 separate attacks against the IDF and Israel. That's a major uptick in recent weeks. We're talking about rockets being fired from Gaza into Israeli territory from multiple points across the Gaza Strip, not just Rafah, but also the northern portion. We've got mortar and small arm attacks being carried out against IDF forces, as well as RPG strikes against IDF armored vehicles, and quite a few already houses and tunnels being detonated inside of Rafah specifically after IDF forces go in to try to clear that area. The type of fighting, the tactics being used at this point by both sides look very, very similar to what we saw play out throughout the rest of the Gaza Strip, which shouldn't really be a shock. Tactics are going to change over the course of a war, but it's been a relatively short period of time to drastically change how one side or the other is going to operate. Then moving over to a couple of these more controversial stories that have popped up in recent days. Both of these, a couple of these at least, kind of circling around the United Nations, which is nothing new when it comes to controversy during this war. The United Nations on Monday said that one of their workers was killed and another injured when their UN-marked vehicle was struck, allegedly by Israel, traveling through Rafah. The Israeli military said that they have begun an investigation, that they could confirm that this vehicle was struck in an active combat zone, and that the incident is under review. It's tragic, right? Anytime an aid worker is killed in a war zone, that's a problem. Wait to see more information come out on this one. But I think it was kind of mixed in with another piece of information that came out on Tuesday, which was drone footage. These are separate events, but there was drone footage that showed a series of Hamas gunmen, a group of Hamas gunmen, operating around UN-marked vehicles at a UN facility. And I'll go ahead and play some of that here. They say, according to the IDF, the gunmen were spotted at UNRWA's logistics center in eastern Rafah. The video shows gunmen next to UN vehicles and in the logistics compound itself, which the IDF says is used by the UN body to deliver humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people. The IDF says that one clip also shows a gunman opening fire inside of the complex. We'll show that here. Not a lot of context as to what is exactly playing out, right? We're getting clips. The key takeaway here is you can clearly see that those are weapons that these people are carrying. You don't have to, it's not much of a stretch to make that determination. Why are there gunmen around some of these UN-marked vehicles and inside of the UN facility? The little bit of context we do need to have when looking at this is the only police force, the only security establishment, if you will, inside of Gaza, inside of Rafah right now, is Hamas. So if anybody is going to protect the humanitarian aid shipments from being looted by civilians, the only entity that can do that right now is Hamas. I don't know that that's exactly what we're seeing in this video, but that is something we have to keep in the back of our mind. They are the governing entity right now, so they are going to have their policemen, if you will, around some of these locations. Just keep that back in mind as we look at some of this footage. All right, then turning over to another controversial topic that's popped up in the last couple days, Gaza casualty reporting. So the United Nations, via reports from the Gaza Health Ministry, significantly changed their reports of how many women and children had died in Gaza since this war began, and it got a lot of attention. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the headlines around this are somewhat misleading, so we're going to dig a little bit deeper to provide some added context. So having previously reported, the United Nations, again, using data from the Gaza Health Ministry, they reported that 9,500 women and 14,500 children had died during this war, which made up around 70% of all fatalities. And that should catch people's attention, right? Even if the numbers of 9,000 and 14,000 aren't enough, it should be in any context, hearing that 70% are women and children should catch people's attention and say, wait a minute, what's going on? Why are so many, typically non-combatants being killed in this war? And that has largely been the reaction. However, they're now reporting that among the identified deaths, 4,959 women have died, along with 7,797 children, which is 52% of the overall casualties in the war. Much more understandable in a lot of ways, not as much of a red flag as you would expect. According to the Times of Israel in a report, they say that constitutes a 52% reduction in the reported number of women killed and a 53% reduction in the reported number of children killed during this war. Now, I want to be careful in how we talk about this because any non-combatants, one non-combatant killed in war is too many. It's tragic, and I don't think it does us a lot of good to nitpick. Like, is the number 401 or 402? That's not really the focus. The focus is the non-combatants dying in war is awful. It happens, unfortunately, and I think given the focus of the casualty reporting in this conflict, it ends up being somewhat important to understanding the broader nature of this war. So looking at the UN statements related to this, because they did just make their change and then, of course, had to follow it up with some statements as to why they made that change. The UN spokesperson Farhan Haq said the ministry's figure now reflected a breakdown of the 24,686 deaths of people who have been fully identified. They say there's another 10,000 plus bodies who have yet to be fully identified, and those details, they could be women, they could be children, and they'll be established once the identification process is complete. So the change here really is you have identified deaths, which that means people who have been registered as fatalities in Gaza's hospitals. Right? They've been moved to the hospital, their official record is made that a person, man, woman, or child, is documented as having died. The unregistered deaths, and this is something that the Gaza Health Ministry has used largely in their reporting from the beginning, we'll get into this here in a second, is when reports of fatalities were collected from what they called reliable media sources. That's understandable to a degree. In the middle of an active war zone, you can't expect that every person who is killed is going to be transported to a hospital to verify their death. Just not realistic, right? There's going to be times where somebody dies, maybe they're not identified, or maybe there's not enough of them to be identified, and they just go straight to the burial process. Or maybe there's nobody available to conduct any sort of burial process, and they remain in the rubble, right? There's a bunch of reasons why people could be reported as dead. A reporter on site says, I saw 5 people go into that building. It was blown up. There's nothing left. I can guarantee that 5 people died. That number matters, and it's correct, but they're not going to be registered, not for some time, if ever. The other side of this is that leaving that open for just people saying a number could lead to a pretty significant discrepancy in how many are being, what the actual number is. And there have been some studies and reports to show that when you look at the verified deaths versus the unregistered deaths, the verified deaths are much closer to 50-50 between women and men, which is what you would expect in a war like this, whereas the unregistered deaths tend to skew much heavier towards a higher volume of women, children, and generally non-combatants. So again, the UN and the Gaza Health Ministry is not saying that the overall number of fatalities has changed. What they're saying is from what they can verify right now, the verified numbers are lower, but they do expect the overall numbers to still be about the same. Again, given the focus that the casualty reporting has gotten in this conflict, I felt like that was worth addressing. All right, then the last piece here, we've got a letter that's been circulating across the internet the last couple days talking about why the United States should support Israel, and it's signed by 80 retired U.S. flag officers. Those are U.S. military generals and admirals. And I'm torn on this. I feel like it's worth talking about and addressing here, but it's a mixed bag, right? On the one hand, that is so much experience, relevant experience to a degree. And we're going to get into that in a second. But to have 80 retired admirals and generals, there's so much knowledge there related to military and national defense. I don't want to write that off at all. Right? A lot of really smart people there, a lot of good experience. On the other hand, I feel like this mode of getting a bunch of retired military officers together to sign something in one direction or another has been politicized and is very easily politicized, and I don't like that at all. It's one thing to sign a letter as a private citizen, but all of these guys in the letter have their rank they retired as and their last position listed there. Touchy, I'll say. But either way, one of the things I wanted to highlight here is you've got a wide range of experience from the people that are signing this letter, and you just have to keep this in mind when you're going through something like this. So on the one hand, we've got, and I'm going to pick on 2 Marines. It's not intentional. I just went at the start and the end of the list. But at the very end of the list here, you got Brigadier General Mulqueen, who, look, incredible service record, right? 30 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, commissioned in 1961, went on to fight in Vietnam. Right? Like, thank you so much for your service. This is crazy. You retired in the early 90s. That was 30 years ago. Not to say this man isn't incredibly smart and has a crazy track record in the U.S. military, impressive track record in the U.S. military, but he's been out of this for 30 years. So how many of those connections has he maintained to really have a good understanding of how things have played out in the Middle East over the last 30 years? That's a big time difference, right? On the other hand, we also have General McKenzie here, who commanded units in Iraq and Afghanistan during combat operations, served as the J5 plans for U.S. Central Command. In 2014, was placed in command of U.S. Marine Corps Forces Central Command, then went to the J5 plans for the Joint Staff, then took overall command of U.S. Central Command from 2019 to 2022, at which point he retired. So that man, on the other hand, very tied in to the current situation in the Middle East. So you've got a wide range of experience and current knowledge of the conflict all wrapped up in this one letter. But diving into some of the statements here, they say, given our experience as retired American military leaders, we are very concerned about the security impacts of increasingly strained U.S.-Israel ties as Israel becomes a growing source of domestic division. We therefore feel compelled to declare that a strong Israel is vital to the United States' national security, and it is imperative that America unequivocally stand by this indispensable ally. They say U.S. support for the only Jewish state should be clear, unwavering, and not conditioned. That, of course, notable because we've started to see more conditioning of aid based off of certain things Israel does or does not do. Hasn't necessarily been a thing in the past, and we're starting to see it come about more and more. They say the Iranian-backed axis of terror, as well as other adversaries and allies around the world, are watching closely to see whether the United States will stand by one of its closest allies fighting in self-defense, even when the going gets tough. And that's a valid argument in Israel, a valid argument, potential conflict in Taiwan. It's a valid argument with Ukraine. There's always that argument to be had is what do our adversaries take away if we don't stand with our allies? Not surprising at all that it comes up here. They say, even in facing adversaries who respect neither the laws of war nor human life, we believe Israel has fought in accordance with the law of armed conflict. That's pretty notable because, every other day, Israel is being accused of committing a violation of the law of armed conflict in one way or another. So to have 80 retired generals and admirals signing on saying, actually, they are abiding by that it was a small part of this letter, but I think that was a major component. They said Israel has traditionally been the source of overwhelming bipartisan support, so it should remain. I actually disagree with that. I think we have to constantly reevaluate our priorities and our relationships around the world. And just because someone has been this is not related to Israel, but just that comment of just because somebody has been an ally in the past does not mean that they are going to be that same level of ally going forward. That makes sense? Times change, things change, conditions change. So I don't like that. Just because it was doesn't mean it will be. But they say we can disagree, as all allies do, as I just did there. But signs of public division only embolden the forces of violence, instability, and extremism that threaten both America and Israel. When we stand together, however, peace and regional stability become possible. It's a valid point. If there's going to be disagreements and a change in the relationship, a very challenging time to do that is in the middle of an armed conflict. It shows division. It shows a gap that could be exploited by adversaries. So we'll see. It's a lot of former senior military officers, some of whom, again, like General McKenzie, likely still have a lot of sway inside of the presidential administration, inside of the Department of Defense, inside of the Department of State, and elsewhere. Some of these others, maybe not as much, but it's a pretty significant letter in that sense to see just how this plays with the current administration or future administration, right? But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. Substack is like a mix between a newsletter and a website. You can sign up and get these articles direct to your inbox, or you can just go to the website and read them yourself. We've got some podcasts going up there, audio articles, which is just the read out loud version of articles talking about things like 3D printed weapons in Myanmar, issues with the cartel in Mexico, security challenges in India, Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, Hezbollah, all sorts of stuff. I think it's pretty interesting, but it's all linked in the description below if you want to check that out. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.